Well, good morning. Today we're continuing another chapter in the book of Daniel, and I hope you've enjoyed the lessons so far and have seen some new insights into this particular wonderful book. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's just begin with a prayer and we'll get right with it. Dear Lord, thank you for today. And I thank you for the lessons that you have taught us, some through the Bible, some through the experiences of our life. And we just ask, Father, that you guide our study today. As always, we're mindful of those around us that are struggling with issues, either from the virus or from issues of their life. And we just we ask your guidance on all of us for the days ahead. We ask that you help us, that you know what to do, and often we don't know what to pray for, and so we trust you to take care of us. Thank you so much for the people who care and help us to be those who care for others. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, in Daniel 8, it starts out in saying, in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me. Daniel, he identifies himself here again, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. Well, he's speaking now about this vision here, which is contained obviously in chapter 8. And the one previously is the one in chapter 7. Now, this is about 2 years later. The first one is in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. This is now in the third year of his reign. And chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 2 are all associated with the same thing. And it is this. If you recall in chapter 2, the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and it was a dream that he had, it was a statue that had 4 different kinds of metals associated with it. And there was also a rock cut out from the mountains that came and struck the image and destroyed it and consumed it. It turns out this is a picture primarily of kingdoms. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is told by Daniel that you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold, but in general, all of the discussion has been about kingdoms, and even there is not much said about this rock except that this rock would come and consume and destroy all the others. Well, now when we turn to chapter 7, we see a similar kind of prophecy, except this time, instead of this image of gold, we have 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. And these 4 beasts now represent the kings of these kingdoms. So Daniel 2 is focused on the kingdoms. Daniel 7 is focused on the kings. And it goes in to great detail then about the rock and the king that's symbolized by this rock, what is called the Son of Man, and as he appears before the Ancient of Days. Consequently, Daniel 7 is talking about the kings. Daniel 2 is talking about the kingdoms. And now in Daniel 8, we're going to focus on specifically the second and the third king and the second and third kingdoms in this vision that he's had before. And here we go. And so Daniel says, I looked at the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa. Now, it doesn't mean that he was there. He's probably still in Babylon, but in his dream, he appears to be in this city of Susa. Now, Babylon is located up here about 200 miles now. To the east, we find the town of Susa, and it is a town in which several things have happened in the past. Number one, Nehemiah made his residence there, and when he was serving the king and before he went back to do the rebuilding in Jerusalem, he is serving the king there in Susa, And the story of Esther also occurs in this particular town. It's also identified as possibly the most likely place for Daniel's tomb to be located there. However, Daniel, like I say, sees himself there. He's probably in Babylon, but he sees this town of Susa. And it goes on to say, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. And so here's a picture of a canal, and so he was seeing all this in this vision. And it says, then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. Evidently he sees this ram, and the ram has 2 horns, and evidently they start growing, and the one that comes up the longest was also the one that came up last, and he sees this ram, and it gets his attention. And then it says the ram was budding toward the west, toward the north, and toward the south. And so any foe that he had, he is going after in all these different directions. And it says no beast could stand before him, and that its victims could not be rescued. And the ram did as he pleased, and then he magnified himself. So he was pleased at his accomplishments, the things that he had killed, the things that he had trampled, the things that he had overcome. He was very pleased with that. It's in 3 different directions now. And when he's through, he magnifies himself and is very proud of what he did. Then Daniel says, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the earth without even touching the ground. Here we have this goat, he's flying, probably signifying the speed at which all of this happened. And he comes and he's flying and he's going over the ground, not even touching it, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him with his mighty wrath. Here is the goat. He is determined to do damage to this goat. To the ram. He's flying through the air, and they indeed do battle. It says, I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat is magnified himself. So he too is very proud of what he has accomplished, and it says exceedingly. And he was probably bragging and carrying on, and suddenly, as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So in its place, here is this now new goat with a new head. It's got 4 different horns instead of 1. The one has now been broken. And then it says, even out of these 4 horns, get this, out of these 4 horns, one of them came forth out of one of them came forth a rather small horn. So one of these 4 produces this smaller horn that grew exceedingly great, so it becomes extremely strong. And it goes to the south, to the east, and toward the beautiful land. Well, we know from the writing of Jeremiah, which had occurred earlier than this, that the beautiful land refers to the land of Palestine. It's also, and this is a phrase that God used for Jeremiah to write down, and beautiful land, and also the phrase a pleasant land. So we know that this is speaking specifically about the land of Israel, the promised land, land of Canaan. And it says, it grew, talking now about this horn, it grew to the host of heaven, caused some of the host and the stars to fall. It trampled them down. It magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and even the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. So this is the image now that Daniel sees, that this one goat had one horn, it finally breaks, and then after it breaks, 4 additional horns grew up, and then out of those 4 horns, one horn starts growing, and it grows in different directions, and it attacks it says the host of heaven, and tramples them down, and even the place of the sanctuary was thrown down, and the sacrifices were stopped. So this is the image that Daniel sees. And it says, this happened on account of the transgression of the host, which will be given over to the horn. So these hosts now will become subject to the horn, and it's because of their sins, because of transgression, that all this is happening. And the regular sacrifice will stop. The truth will be flung to the ground, and the horn will perform its will and prosper. Daniel is perplexed at this, and he asks this question: how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply? And while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, 2,300 days. Said at that time, then the holy place will be properly restored. So there's a period of time when the horn comes in, tramples down the host, upsets the temple worship, and it will last for a period of time. But then at the end of 2,300 days, the holy place will be properly restored. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. So here at this canal, we see Daniel, and there's another image there, and he said it looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai, which is the canal. He hears a voice, and this voice calls out and says, Gabriel. So now we know who this man is Gabriel the angel. Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Well, Gabriel now has this particular assignment, and as we see down through the Bible, he's given several specific assignments. Number one, he does the birth announcements of John the Baptist to Zacharias. He does the birth announcements of Jesus to Mary, and he is now going to explain to Daniel what the meaning of these visions that Daniel has been seeing, what they mean. So Gabriel now comes near, and because Daniel, I guess, knows who Gabriel is and sees all this, it says Daniel is frightened. He goes into a deep sleep, and still in his vision, he bows down to Gabriel. Gabriel turns then to Daniel and tells him to stand. Now, if you remember, in the last chapter of the last book of the Bible, Revelation 22, John has just seen a vision, and an angel has told him all about this particular event. And because of that, John bows down to this angel. And when he does that, the angel says this, says, don't do that. I am a fellow servant of yours. Don't bow down to me. I am a fellow servant of yours. Remember what Hebrews says? It says, angels, they're ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. In essence, Daniel is being told by Gabriel here, don't bow down to me. I am a fellow servant of yours. And so Daniel is told that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. And when you hear a phrase like the end, what do you think? Is this what comes to mind to begin with? The end of the world? That's certainly a significant topic, and we see a lot of even little posters about that. Turns out I looked on the internet, and we know everything on the internet is true, that over probably the last 100 years, there have been over 200 predictions about the end of the world, about when it was going to come, the exact time, the exact date, etc. I remember a story that my dad told. He had a store in Wheeler, Texas, and back in the 1940s, there was a date that was set in which the end of the world was predicted to come. The world's predicted to come to an end. And it had the date and the time and everything else. And Dad said, I never believed it. You know, if the Lord said nobody knows, I didn't think anybody knew. And he said, but you can't keep from thinking about it. So when that day came, he was in his office by himself, nobody else in the store. And about at the appointed time, he hears this startling and surprising crash in the store. And he said, I thought, well, maybe they're right this time. Turns out he had a mirror for sale, and it was hanging on the wall, huge mirror. And it came loose from its moorings, and it came down, crashed, and he walks out, and he said, well, they were wrong again. Turns out all 200 have failed over time. Indeed, no man knows. So when you hear the words, the end, we have to figure out what the end is. In another case in the Bible, it didn't talk about the end, but it talks about the beginning. Peter, in Acts 11, makes the comment, it says these things happen, and he talks about what they were, at the beginning. Well, here's the words, the beginning. Is that the beginning creation, or is it the beginning of a particular era? Well, it turns out it's the beginning of a particular era. For Peter, it was the beginning of God's kingdom and his rule with Jesus. And so now we have this phrase that says the end. What do we do? Well, we have to figure out what it is, and we have to do that in keeping with what Daniel is writing here. Over the years, I've kind of come to these conclusions in interpreting Bible prophecies. Number one, you need to look at the context. What is the context that's going on right now? The context is he's explaining beast number 2 and beast number 3. He said there's 4 beasts, something's going to happen after that, but now these are the things that's going to happen with these 2 particular beasts. And so they were depicted first in the previous chapter, in chapter 7, as a bear and a leopard with 4 heads. Remember that? Well, now we have a ram and a goat that has turns out with 4 horns, and now an extraneous horn that grows out from that. And so we have the context of what's going on is a time frame of these two particular beasts. And if we look at the big picture, what is Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and now Daniel 8 talking about? It's talking about the time of these kings is going to come to an end, and another king is going to come forth that will have dominion over all of them. Also, we have to be careful because in looking at prophecy, sometimes there's a double meaning. Sometimes what is said here has a significant impact somewhere else and is meant something entirely different over time. And sometimes what is said to be physical is also a spiritual impact. For example, it talks about the incense of the temple worship during Moses' time. Well, that was symbolic of the prayers that went up to God. And we know that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Passover lamb and all of those. So there were shadows and significant things physically which also had meaning elsewhere. So you have to figure all of that out. And then basically, let's just simply see what the Bible says about this particular point. And turns out the Bible's going to say a lot of specific things. This is exactly what this means. So let's continue on with the interpretation of these prophecies. Number 1, it says the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, remember one was longer than the other, represents the kings of Media and Persia. So we know who those were because the Bible says who they were. It was Darius and it was Cyrus were the 2 ones that he had been speaking about. When Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar about his dream, he said, this head of gold, that's you. So this is all now very consistent. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. The next portion of that statue, the two kings are Darius and Cyrus. And then it says the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And if you look at history, sure enough, it was the Babylonian time period, then the Medes and the Persian time period together, and now the Grecian time period. And so history bears out exactly what Daniel is talking about. And this shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Well, who would that be? Well, that would be Alexander the Great. And it says then that the broken horn, what about the broken horn? It said as soon, the text earlier said, as soon as he magnified himself, the horn was broken off. Alexander the Great started his conquest when he was about 20. He died when he was 33 of natural causes, and consequently, that was the image of the first king that it was broken off, and he was no longer there. His kingdom then was divided into 4 different kingdoms, and it's exactly what is said here. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And so the second image that is shown is the goat, the goat with 4 horns. And it said, if you remember, that out of one of these horns would come a small horn, but would get exceedingly great. The 4 horns represent then the 4 kingdoms of Alexander the Great as it was divided up. You can see them there: Egypt and Palestine, Babylonia and Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece and Macedon. So each one of these guys, the kings that ran these particular kingdoms, you can go on the internet and find out who they were. There are specific names there. But remember, out of one of them now comes this extraneous leader, this extraneous king who has a very significant impact, and he's the one who is going to trample down the host and trample down and stop the temple worship, etc. And it turns out, it says, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise. He will be insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy in extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. And he will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. You remember in Daniel 8, a little bit earlier, it said, from out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. So here is exactly the interpretation of that particular verse. And although his shrewdness, and through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. And he will even oppose the prince of princes, but he himself will be broken without human agency. Turns out, if we look at history, here's what we find. Out of the 4 kingdoms that existed, the Babylonian and Syria kingdom produced a ruler that was several kings later, but his name was Antiochus. And when he took over, he decided, I guess, his kingdom was not big enough, and so he started to go down to Egypt and acquire that territory for himself. As he passed through Israel, well, let me show you some of these events. He appointed the high priest when he came through Jerusalem. So on his way down to Egypt, he stops in that area. It's now his territory. He stops, he takes the high priest that's currently in charge there and takes him out of office and puts in his own person. And this upset the Jews very much. And he then leaves and goes on down his conquest on down to Egypt. But while he's down there, word gets back that Antiochus has been killed in Egypt. Turns out it's what we know of today as fake news. But when that word reached back to Jerusalem, it made the people who were in power, which was the Maccabees at the time, very excited. They then run Antiochus priest, who he had appointed, run him out of town, and they put in now their own guy, who was the guy to begin with, before Antiochus came in and appointed a different person. So the Maccabean Jews took those matters into their own hands. Antiochus hears about that in Egypt. He turns around, he comes back to Jerusalem, attacks Jerusalem, and for 3 days, history says that over 40,000 people were killed with no mercy. And they were men and women and children and infants, and he showed no mercy wherever he went. 40,000 others were also sold as slaves, and so he must have rounded up people even outside Jerusalem to get that many people. He then outlawed the Jewish rites and forced the worship of Zeus, and even set up an image of Zeus in the temple, and started going by the name Epiphanes, and which means God revealed. And so he considered himself a god, that he had now been revealed to the people, and he instigated the worship of himself, even had a coin made with his image on it. And in fact, here's a time frame of his reign. He started in about 175 BC and continued on until his death, until 164. During that time period, in 171 BC to 165 is when he started the heavy persecution. He made a decree in 171 that there would be no more sacrifices, temple worship, and the feast, the Passover feast and feasts like that were all banned. All ceremonial rites, such as circumcision of the kids, in fact, even of the boys. Even one of the commentators said that if a woman had taken her son to be circumcised and they found out about it, the child was hung around her neck and they both were killed. This was just how brutal and cruel he was to the Jews. The ceremonial rites were outlawed. Possession of the scriptures even resulted in a capital offense. And the king worship was required, and he goes in and he sacrifices on the altar, the burnt offering that took place on the altar outside the front of the temple. He sacrificed an unclean animal. He entered himself into the Holy of Holies, which he was not supposed to do. He set up the idol of Zeus, and then he also looted the place, much like Nebuchadnezzar had done many years earlier. So this was the persecution, and that lasted from 171 to about 165. Turns out the temple was desecrated, as I just mentioned, in 168, but prior to 165, about 166, the Maccabees regained control of Jerusalem, and therefore regained control of the temple, and they had a rededication of the temple at that time, and that rededication is actually honored and celebrated even today. It's called Hanukkah. It's one that we all hear about and are familiar with. If you read the Gospels, you realize that Jesus was in the temple one day where the dedication was taking place. It was the week of dedication. So we read about that in the Gospels as well. The Maccabees, right after the temple was desecrated, is when the Maccabean War started, and there were about 7 wars there, lasted for 6 to 7 years. But Antiochus died in 164. Let's see. So the persecution, what Daniel said would happen in a 2,300-day period of time, and then the temple activities would be restored. And sure enough, that correlates to what is mentioned in history. Antiochus said that he will be broken without human agency. So another king didn't come in and depose him. It turns out he started having stomach problems, evidently. And he had severe pains, and in fact so bad that one time he even fell out of his chariot, writhing in pain. And it's even depicted in artist renditions. He was a madman who instigated all the persecutions. He instigated the worship of himself, and he fell, and he ultimately died from that. And it said, not with human agency. No human did that. God did that himself. One of the writings in the Maccabees says this, that the God of Israel struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. Painful, natural causes. If you contrast Antiochus' life and that with Nebuchadnezzar, they both conquered Jerusalem. They both did away with temple worship and things like that, looted the temple. But Nebuchadnezzar, as you know, had his wings plucked, as the last chapter said. When he finally came to himself, he lifted up and was made to stand like a man, given a human mind, and at the end sent a decree out to his whole kingdom and said, this is the God who we need to worship. It's the God of Daniel, and it's he who Nebuchadnezzar exalts. And so Nebuchadnezzar has an entirely different ending than that of Antiochus. So the vision of the evenings and the mornings which had been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. It says, then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. That is what is in chapter 8. So let's summarize that. Number one, we see that the ram's two horns were very clearly identified as Darius and Cyrus. They had been identified as the two people that took over Babylon in the previous chapter. The goat's single horn, if we use the same rules of interpretation, would have been Alexander the Great, and sure enough, he passed when he was at a very early age. And the kingdom was then divided into 4 regions, and we see that actually came true. And then a king would arise and halt the temple worship, and Antiochus fits that to a T. The persecution lasted for 6+ years, from 171 to 165, and that corresponds to the 2,300 days. The rededication of the temple did occur in 165, and that's celebrated in history and even celebrated in a holiday that is still observed by the Jewish people today. And the period of indignation, let's say this is where I need a class to help me out. The period of this troubled time could be several things. I found these 4 possibilities in the commentaries. The immediate persecution, the exile period of 70 years, the world rulers, when the 4 major world rulers come to an end and the stone comes and crushes and consumes all those kingdoms, and it even transposes to the second coming of Christ. If you say, well, what is Daniel trying to do? If we look at the context and we look at the picture that's what's being depicted here in chapter 2, chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8, all are talking about a time period of these 4 kings when this ruling of the world powers will come to an end, and there will be a different kind of kingdom that will last forever. And so if we stick with those kind of rules, it looks like it's primarily the persecution time. Maybe it's exile, and maybe it has reference later to the world rulers and when they come to an end, and maybe even the second coming of Christ. You know, often in the Bible there are ways that what is said earlier is referred to and said, this is like what that was, or this is what that was. And I'll let you work your way through those interpretations yourself. And here's a very interesting point. God uses imperfect people to do his will. He used Alexander the Great, who took over from Darius and Cyrus. He used the four kingdoms. He used this Antiochus and used imperfect people to accomplish what he wanted. And in fact, sometimes these imperfect people are really imperfect. They're bad people. They're bad people, and they do bad things. They do horrible things. And yet God uses them to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, but he still holds them accountable. Look at this verse. This is in Jeremiah. He's talking about the captivity of Judah in Babylon. It says, and then it will be 70 years, then it will be, when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity. So when God uses imperfect people, who else is he going to use? All of us are imperfect. We're all tainted with sin. Some worse than others in our eyes. Maybe that's not the way God looks at it. And here we have God using a very imperfect person. But just because he used Nebuchadnezzar and all of these people, he does not allow them to escape the punishment that's due them. And so Antiochus had to pay the price for that. I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity. So what are we seeing here in Daniel? We're seeing that God is using the kingdoms of this world to accomplish his will, yet he still holds them accountable, and he's making the point in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, that these kings, they play a part, but they are playing a part of a bigger picture, and that is there is a kingdom that's coming that's going to consume all of these pictures. And so I see here in Daniel 8 the picture of a greater explanation of the kingdom of Persia and the Medes, and the kingdom of Greece, those particular kingdoms. And these interpretations in Daniel 8 are the ones that seem to be focused on that specific time period. So, what's the importance of us? What do we take away from it? What's the conclusion of the whole matter? What are these prophecies? These are prophecies that happened in the past. Their fulfillment has come and gone. What does that mean? Well, I think it's this. God gave a glimpse ahead of time to let it be known what would happen. He gave these prophecies such that this is something that was going to happen in the future. To let it be known what would happen. So, when it did happen, it could then be known that Jehovah or Yahweh or Elohim was and / is the Most High God, ruler of heaven and earth. That is the fundamental lesson that Daniel saw. That's the fundamental lesson that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, that there would be coming a king, and he would crush all these kingdoms, he would consume all these kingdoms, and his kingdom would be one that would last forever. And God said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it ahead of time so that when it happens, you'll know. Jesus, toward the end of his ministry, tells the 12, said, I tell you these things such that when they occur, talking about things that would happen later, that when they occur, you may believe. And so prophecies are given primarily to build our faith, to realize that God is in control. He is the ruler of this heaven and this earth. May God bless you. May you have a great week. Amen.